So it is 10 a.m. ET time. Thank you everyone who's joined us. For those of you who joined us a few minutes early, welcome. I imagine people will continue to trickle in over the next couple of minutes, but why don't we get going? We have a lot to talk about today, and we want to make sure there's time for those of you who want to ask questions to ask questions. So first of all, just to say very warm welcome. Thank you for making the time to be with us today and to engage. This is an opportunity for us to share some information with you, but also hear back from you as well. We have simultaneous interpretation in English and in Spanish. So at the bottom, please make sure that you select the language channel that you're interested in. So you can see English or Spanish, and I'll invite Viviani to share that message in Spanish as well.
Bienvenida a todas las personas. Espero que...
Welcome everyone. I hope you can hear me well. Thank you for joining us in this webinar. And we ask that if possible, you introduce yourself in the chat, that you also use the Q&A function to add your comments. Welcome. And and you can select for interpretation between English and Spanish by going to the interpretation button, the little globe, and select Spanish. Thank you so much and welcome again.
And we've also asked you all when you join to do a quick poll. We're very interested in seeing who's in the room with us. So if you could fill that out. And then as Viviani said, also, we'd love to know a little bit more about you. I can see some of your names. I recognize some. It's great to see former members of our grant making panel board, grantee partners and other organizations we've worked with. So thank you again for joining us. Before we get started, I just wanted to do a quick introduction of the team, of the ITF team who's on the call today. So for those of you who don't know me, my name is Broden Jambroni and I'm the director at the ITF. We're also joined by Chivuli Ukwimi, who's the deputy director at the ITF. We have Mukasa Samora, who's our senior program officer, who's actually been with the ITF the longest. We have Viviani Simakawa, who is our program officer, and Luca Lucchina, who is our comms officer. So you'll be hearing from all of us through today, but just so you can put some names to faces, we're also joined by Melissa Eckstein, who is our impact evaluation external consultant. So you can see Melissa there. Luca, could you put the agenda up on the screen, please? And I should say we are also joined by Chavita and Maria, who are our interpreters. And we wouldn't be able to do this meeting and do it with the kind of commitment to language justice that we want to without them. So thank you to Chavita and Maria. So this is what we're going to do today. It's not a complex, long agenda, but we are going to, right now, you're in the welcome intro section, which we're going to wrap up shortly before moving into the impact evaluation presentation. So that's going to be done by Melissa. Followed by that, we'll have the ITF response. So for that one, that's actually... It's not specifically a response to the impact evaluation per se, but it's an opportunity for us to share some of the highlights. And again, in our commitment to accountability and transparency, to share a little bit about where we're going to be going in the near future. And then we have a Q&A discussion. So the plan is to have about 30 minutes at least. We really want a chance to engage with you all and give you a chance to connect with us. At the moment, or the way we're going to do it, is that we'll have the presentations first. We would invite you to make any comments or put any questions in the chat box. And then at the end, we're going to address all of them and then invite you to ask any additional questions that might come up. So you might have things that come up specifically in response to Melissa. That's great. So you don't forget it. Please include that. And then if you have any questions for the ITF team, we have time for all of that. Luca, would you share us back the results of the poll so far so we can see who's in the room? Okay, interesting. So we have a good mix of folks. We have past and current members of our grant making panel and our board. We have some past current grantee partners as well. We have some past current funders of the ITF and other funders who are in the space. And then we also have some ITF applicants. So those would be individuals who've applied for grants but haven't received them, and other. So interesting. Whoever the other are, we'd love to hear more. So please introduce yourself in the chat box. It would be great to get to know who's in the room with us today. So the goal of today is that we are going to share some of the findings of our 5-year impact evaluation with our community. As I mentioned before, this is a report back, or we're thinking of it as an accountability session. Some of you may have participated in interviews for this. Some of you may not have. The impact evaluation really focused on folks who are already engaged with the ITF. So if you were an applicant or you hadn't otherwise been funded by the ITF or been involved in ITF, you won't hear your voice heard. And we want to acknowledge that as part of this process. But the impact evaluation has given us opportunity to delve deeper into how we work as an organization, what we are doing well. There's some great information in the impact evaluation talking about what the ITF has meant and what we've done and the kind of impact we've had. But there's also quite a bit that, we can do better. And we're thinking about all of this as we look forward into the next stage of the ITF. And I would say that the resounding message that we heard from this process is that the ITF plays a very critical, a very vital role in supporting global trans movements, and especially now more than ever with the rise of the anti-gender and anti-rights movements, and just given the realities that so many groups are working on the ground, that we need an ITF, and we need an ITF that is strong and sustainable, that can move money to trans-led groups across the globe. And, one of my favorite quotes from the impact evaluation was that one person said, if the community are the movers and shakers, the ITF is the spine. So we really hold on tight to that. And that's something that we want to draw from and draw on in terms of the positivity that we approach our work. But it was also clear that there are a number of ways that we need to improve and deepen our work. We're a young organization. We've really only been around since 2017 and became formally incorporated in 2022. So, there's a lot more to do, and we know that. And we've already taken some immediate steps to respond to some of the findings in the impact evaluation. And we've also taken some immediate steps anyway, in terms of where we want to go. So we're using this as an opportunity to reflect and improve our work, but we also see this as a philanthropic advocacy tool. And what I mean by that is we want to take the impact evaluation, bring it to funders who are interested in funding global trans movements, and say, look, the ITF is one very critical mechanism to move money. We're not the only one, and more money needs to flow to trans-led groups across the board, but the ITF is a really great mechanism to do that, especially to get to organizations that are smaller, maybe haven't been funded before. We can do that. But one of the biggest constraints we have, and you'll see this in the impact evaluation, is our own funding. So things like renewal grants, things like, expanding the amount of money we move, that comes in a lot of cases from our own under-resourcing. So that's something as well that we've been thinking a lot about, how to better use this. And we had a funder briefing with some of our funders back in December, and our intention in 2024 is to build on that. So with that, I'm going to pause, and I'm going to pass the mic to Chivuli to share a little bit more about the impact evaluation goals and process before we get into the next phase. But welcome again, and I'm so glad you're all here.
Thank you, Broden. And just to echo Broden, welcome everyone, and thank you for being in this space. I'm happy to have you here and just for us to share some of the results from our impact evaluation, but also for you, this being an opportunity for you to hear more about what we at the ITF are doing. So just to give a bit of a background, over our implementation period, we've had multiple conversations and engagements with our grantee partners. And this has revealed that there's a lot of amazing results that are being implemented on the ground. However, a lot of the reporting that has been coming to us has been activity rather than results-based. And this means that some of the results and the impact that is being had there is being lost. And it is for this reason that we have acknowledged that we need a systematic way to capture the stories of change, to demonstrate impact of our funding and also the work of our grantees, so that the great work that we're doing is not just lost out there. So the ITF has adopted a results-based monitoring approach to M&E with an increased focus on project results and outcomes as opposed to only tracking activities. Because when we track activities and outputs, some of the questions that are asked is, okay, you had these activities, so what? You know, and if we don't have a systematic way of capturing this, we might, a lot of our funders and donors out there might think that maybe we're not achieving the results that we said we're achieving. So we are currently finalizing an M&E framework, which will depict the causal linkage between an intervention and the desired impact through a series of expected intermediate results. And we're going to place emphasis on those activities that play a key role in leveraging change, because we want to demonstrate that change is happening. It may not happen at the rate that we want it to happen, but there is change that's happening out there. And key performance indicators that measure the results will be defined in this results framework. And last year, I mean, recognizing that we were in our 6th year of implementation, we sought to conduct an impact evaluation study of the organization and of the 5 past grant cycles. And the objective of this evaluation was to enable the ITF assess its impact over the past 7 years, bearing in mind its expanded areas of intervention, with a view to strengthen and enhance our impact on delivering on our mandate. So the commissioning and launch of this impact evaluation report ties in very well with the development of the M&E framework that I've just been speaking to. And as Broden was speaking, it is important that we have a demonstration of these results, because if the ITF is the intermediary and if the ITF is the vehicle through which these funds are being channeled, and if the ITF will still remain that relevant body through which funders can channel funding to groups on the ground, it is important that the ITF then is able to demonstrate the impact of this work. So let me get right into it. Invite Melissa, who was amazing for this work. Some of you in the room may have met Melissa by being respondents to the evaluation. Some of you not, but I'm sure you are as excited as I am to hear what the results were from this evaluation. Melissa, over to you.
Thank you, Chibuli. It's a pleasure to be here with everyone today and share back what we learned through this fairly extensive evaluation process. So it's not going to include every voice in the trans movements, not all of you in this room, but we hope, we think it is representative, hopefully, and we hope this is a moment to learn together about what is happening in the world as a result of the ITF's work. So why don't we pull up the slideshow, Luca? All right. So I'm going to go over what's in the evaluation report at a high level. If you haven't had a chance to read the full report, it's available in English and in Spanish on the ITF's website. And I highly encourage you to dig in and look at some of the rich detail and beautiful quotes from people that are there. So the evaluation, like I think Broden and Chibuli might have already said, looked back at the first 5 years of the ITF's existence and tried to determine, to the best way possible, what has the impact of that work been so far. Luca, next. All right, so what I'm going to go over briefly today, first talk quickly about the evaluation goals and methods, then move into a high-level review of the findings of the evaluation, what we learned, and lastly, cover recommendations, both from myself, but also from everyone who participated in the evaluation process. Next slide. All right, so let's start with the evaluation goals and methods. Next slide. So these were the evaluation goals. It was both a review process and an evaluation process. So we wanted to review the ITF's governance, the structure, how it's working, the processes the organization has been using, and its activities. And we also wanted to try and evaluate what has the impact been of the ITF's grant making, of the ITF's institutional strengthening work to strengthen the ITF as its own participatory fund, evaluate what has been the impact of the ITF's capacity building work and accompaniment with grantee partners and with the broader community, and what has been the result of the philanthropic advocacy that the ITF has done so far. So that was the scope of what we looked to learn. The evaluation activities, what did I do? We did a broad survey reaching out to current staff, current and past board and steering committee members, current and past grant-making panel members, current and past grantee partners, and some donors and friends of the ITF. We did it in multiple languages to try to uphold the attention to language justice and make it as accessible as possible. We had 112 people respond. So that was the majority of where we collected information from. I also interviewed representatives of 5 of the ITF's institutional donors. I reviewed documents that existed, past evaluation that had been happening from parts of the work, analyzed all of this, looked for themes, and developed the report that we're talking about today. Next slide, Luca. So let's move on to the high-level findings. Next. Overall, the ITF is making progress towards its mission, which many of you probably know. But at a high level, the ITF has successfully mobilized and increased access to many resources for strong trans-led movements and collective action. This has included awarding in US dollars $3.867 million to 133 grantee partners in 80 countries. The ITF has advocated within philanthropy to address broader funding gaps impacting trans groups across the globe, and made inroads on that front. Trans movements we're seeing are now stronger and made up of more defined, sustainable organizations. And then as a mechanism to support trans-led groups, the ITF has grown into an established, respected, independent organization during its first 5 years. All right, next slide. So this, before we get into all the details, this quote really kind of summed up what I was hearing from participants in the evaluation. Immense gratitude. Thank you for your existence. And we want more. Everyone who contributed to the evaluation shared that ITF's a wonderful thing. It's not able to meet all of the needs of the trans movements, of the community. And so they're asking for more when that's possible. I think the work ahead for the ITF is clear: grow and advocate to generate even more sustainable resources for trans movements so that all trans-led groups who want and need funding and other support can find it from the ITF and from other sources. Right, next slide. All right, so a big part of this story is that over the last 5 years, the ITF has built and sustained a mechanism to support trans-led groups of different sizes working on a range of issues at the international, regional, country, and local levels, with an emphasis on groups that have access to fewer resources. The ITF has grown and improved as an institution, and people see that. One great quote I got from a survey respondent said, "The ITF has had enormous growth, moving from a fledgling organization to an established peer grant maker." You see, there's been organizational growth and development. One person noted the ITF has grown in a thoughtful, methodical way. There's been an increase in trust between the ITF and the trans movements groups across the globe. And there's been a real attention, and we're seeing the effects of investment in trans leadership. As one person shared, the efforts to ensure we are trans-led has borne fruit, and we are a reflection of the spirit we aimed for. So overall, the ITF has grown into an established but rare philanthropic institution, one that, in the words of one donor, is extremely collaborative, approachable, and accountable. It continues to grow and reflect as an organization. The ITF is adjusting, adapting, and evolving without, as one person said, shying away from problematic aspects. So a lot to be proud of for all of you who have been part of the ITF's journey. All right, next slide. So moving on to look at the governance structure, working methods, and processes, the entire way the ITF works has been, as one person said, an important intervention in how trans issues have been funded before. Being a participatory fund that's led by the community and includes members of the community that look at the actual grants and review them. That was from one of the ITF's institutional donors. The governing bodies have been a way to bring the expertise and politics of the trans movement into a philanthropic space, and for the ITF to create policies and approaches and talk about accountability to the movement in a different way than individuals from the community can do in their separate philanthropic organizations. Overall, people think that the ITF's governance structure, working methods, and processes are contributing to its impact. For the most part, staff, board, and grant-making panel have what they need to fulfill their roles and are functioning well. We found some room for improvement, particularly in the area of the board, moving towards certain aspects, maybe tweaking certain aspects among the staff, but overall, there was some really positive responses about how these areas are working. All right, next slide. Yes, and I hope, sorry, Luca just put in the chat, there is a link to this presentation in Spanish. For those of you who are listening in Spanish, you can follow that and be able to follow along there as well. Thank you, Luca. All right, moving on to grant making. The ITF has moved a lot of money to trans organizations. That's how one institutional donor summed it up, and I think that really nails it. The ITF has increased the financial resources dedicated to trans-led organizations and groups. The funding is reaching groups with limited resources as intended, ones that are engaged in movement building activities. Almost all participants who filled out the evaluation survey agreed with that statement. 35% of the grantee partners who responded to the survey said the ITF was their first institutional donor, which is a sign of the kinds of groups the ITF is funding. 26% of the grantee partners who responded to the survey are unregistered groups. And another sign of the kinds of groups the ITF is able to reach is that the year before receiving their grant from the ITF, 85% of grantee partners who responded to the survey had budgets of less than US $50,000. Overall, the ITF has resourced the movement in an effective and robust way, as one person shared, and in a way that's values aligned. They noted that without the ITF, the movement will be much less resourced at the grassroots level. Resources have contributed to the ITF's grantee partners being able to work on change at multiple levels, from the local communities up to the international level, focusing on issue areas that they've deemed most important. including what was most commonly named in the survey: community building or mobilization, mental health and well-being, access to healthcare discrimination, health and legal gender recognition, among others. And some common approaches grantee partners said they have been using: movement building and change-making activities, including most commonly support groups, awareness raising events, training sessions, mobilizing communities, and community spaces. The grant making approach, people really see aspects of the ITF's grant making approach contribute to its impact. Aspects that were more commonly named are ITF's approachability, accessibility, commitment to language justice, webinars, videos, the draft review service, the way the ITF's applications are, and the way grants are often given as general support and with some level of flexibility. I see a question about grant making challenges. I was going to get to that next. Thank you for raising that. I know it's a third pillar on this slide, but it really was a smaller aspect of what I heard from people. But of course, there's challenges in any grant making operation. Related to what I started this presentation with, the main challenge is that there are limited resources and that there's a lot of need and desire for funding from the ITF. So the ITF is doing the best it can to increase those resources, to mobilize other funders to fund, but the ITF is not able to give all of the money that people are requesting and applying for. And another area kind of curiosity, of challenges is related to how the ITF focuses on grant making as opposed to high-level policy change and global movement agendas. And so that's just kind of an interesting question as the ITF moves forward. What is the ITF's role in that global policy change? How does the grant making fit in, and how are those considered? Next slide, please. Okay, so here's just a quick overview. This is right from the report. These are the top 6 responses when we asked grantee partners to share what issue-specific changes they have been seeing in their community and their environment that have, at least in part, been due to ITF funding. So you'll see that a lot of them are related to healthcare and health and awareness, which was an interesting finding to me. All right, next slide. Okay, I'm going to review the questions as I can while I'm presenting, but some of them will save to the Q&A time. So if I do not answer your question right now, I'm not ignoring you, just sticking to the presentation for the moment, and there will be space later. All right, so another really interesting finding, and the full responses are in the report, but we asked grantee partners what are broad signs of social change that they have been seeing, again, at least in part due to the ITF's funding. And we're seeing lots of signs of strengthened trans communities, strengthened and mobilized trans movements. All right, next slide. Okay, so moving on to capacity building and accompaniment, another main arm of what the ITF is trying to do. What we've seen is that the ITF has built the capacity and supported grantee partners, individual activists within those organizations, and trans movements more broadly. And individual activists, I would say, doesn't even just apply to grantee partners, but also members of the board or the steering committee and the grant making panel. All of the capacity building activities that I referenced before have been contributing to this. Of grantee partners who responded to the survey, 88% had received at least one kind of support from the ITF in addition to money. So this capacity building is happening on a broad scale among grantee partners. Most evaluation survey respondents agree that the activities designed and implemented by the ITF had addressed the identified capacity needs of participants and have improved their skills. Most also agreed that the ITF has provided meaningful support or accompaniment to its grantee partners. The DRS draft review service gets really positive feedback as well. Almost all of the participants from the 4th through 6th grant cycle of the DRS said the funding webinars have helped their organization both to have a better understanding of the criteria and what makes a strong application to the ITF, and to write a better, stronger application to the ITF for funding. Most participants also said that that service helped their organization gain general skills on writing grant applications, so that can apply to applications to other funding sources as well. Just seeing if there's anything else I want to note here. As it says on the slide, in particular, the impact we've seen on individual activists is that they have built their capacity and influenced their attitudes towards an understanding of philanthropy and participatory grant making, which has been a particular aspect of the fund and of its awareness raising. And at the trans movements level, people have seen that trans groups and activists have become more connected to each other and more supported, and that the infrastructure of trans movements has been made stronger and increased as a result of the ITF's existence. Next slide, please. And here's an overview of the top answers when we asked grantee partners what organizational changes have they seen. So again, growth, visibility, stability, being able to look and plan for the future. And this is all what people have seen as a result of ITF funding, capacity building, and or accompaniment. Next slide. Philanthropic advocacy. This is another big area we're going to treat at a very high level right now, but there's two main ways that the ITF has made change since it started, and it's both changing the landscape through its own existence and fundraising. So through the mechanism of the ITF, more trans groups are receiving funding, the movements are better resourced, the visibility of both grantee partners and the ITF has increased. And then the other main mechanism is that ITF has been changing the landscape by advocating to others. So advocating for more resources, advocating for different ways that funders can support the movements. So I encourage you to read more about that in the report. Next slide. Okay, we'll move on to the recommendations. Next slide, please, Luca. Okay, so these were the large themes that we found from what participants in the evaluation shared. What their suggestions would be for how the ITF could continue to grow and improve. One would be to operate with even more transparency and communication. Two, for the ITF to grant more money and with more continuity. Three, for the ITF to continue to build systems and infrastructure to meet the extensive requests and the needs of a growing organization, as well as to have a greater impact. Fourth suggestion for improvement is to build and connect monitoring and evaluation, fundraising, and strategy. Yes, I will read more slowly. Thank you, Chavita. Next one is to develop its governing bodies. So continue to build the capacity and the abilities of the board, of the grant making panel. Similarly, another recommendation is to grow the capacity building offerings available to grantee partners. Many grantee partners are hungry for more in that area. And then lastly, to continue the philanthropic advocacy, adapting strategies to the changing context as needed. The world is obviously constantly changing, and the ITF needs to just continue to be flexible, to be as strategic as possible in its philanthropic advocacy. Next slide, please. All right. I tried to sum up my recommendations as the evaluator into 3 main suggestions. One is to grow the grant making and infrastructure, particularly using this evaluation report, as we talked about at the beginning of this webinar, to raise more funds for grant making, ideally multi-year grant making, and to raise more funds to build the ITF's infrastructure and staff. 2, to hire a monitoring and evaluation role. And this speaks to what Shivuli was already talking about, that's underway, to increase the ITF's capacity to collect, document, analyze, synthesize, and communicate information on the ITF's and its grantee partners' impact to all ITF stakeholders. And 3, to reflect on the evaluation findings and also be realistically responsive. To really listen as a staff, as a community, reflect on the findings and feedback in the report. As staff and governing bodies, make your own collective determinations of what to do next. Try and be as responsive as possible, as the ITF is committed to, and also balance that with being realistic about what the ITF has the capacity to address and on what timeline. Use the data and what you know about the trans movements to make informed choices about where the ITF puts its limited resources, both internally and externally. Next slide. So I'll wrap up my presentation with this quote, another one that really stood out. You are incredible, speaking to the ITF. Please don't go anywhere. We will always rely on you. Develop, engage us. I think that really wraps up what the ITF has managed to accomplish so far, the critical role that ITF plays among trans movements and communities, and the encouragement to continue to grow and change and work to support everyone in the trans movements as well as possible. Next slide. So change is already happening, and I am going to pass this back to the ITF staff to share more about what the ITF has been working on and what's in store for the near future. Thank you all.
Thank you, Melissa. You know, we're so lucky to have had you engage with us over the last couple of years. And just to let folks on this call know, this is not the only place. You know, we've had Melissa in to talk to our board. We've had Melissa in to speak to our staff. That piece about reflection and how we might adopt some of the recommendations, maybe not all, as Melissa said, there is a realisticness that we're trying to align, taking it very seriously. I know I speak for all of the staff here on the call and off the call and the board and the grant making panel. We all aspire for the ITF to be the best version of itself. And so thank you for ending on that great quote. I think that's a great pivot for us to share a little bit with you about what we're doing. What we're going to do is go through a brief presentation looking at the pillars. So Melissa spoke to them as well. Our 4 strategic pillars are grant making, capacity building, philanthropic advocacy, and institutional strengthening. So we're going to give you a few highlights from the recent past in terms of what we've been doing, both in response to the impact evaluation, but also in general, and then sharing a little bit about what comes next. So what are we working on in 2024 and beyond? So I would like to invite Mukasa to start us off. Luke, if you could start us at the grant making slide. Yeah, I think that would be great. And as we said, please put your questions in the Q&A box, the chat box. We'll come back to them at the end of this and look at everything. And we'll be able to have a bit more of a discussion. So if you have any questions for Melissa, please hold on to them or share them, and we will come back to them. And then we'll also finish our presentation and we can have a whole conversation. So with that, I will pass it to you, Mukasa.
Thanks, Broden. Yeah, so I have the pleasure to share with you about ITF grant making and impact. And this is one of our strategic goals that's in our strategic plan. Next slide, please. So our objective here in grant making is to increase and expand the ITF's direct grant making to translate organizations with limited resources that are engaged in movement building activities. I guess a lot has really been said generally, but now we're really talking about our pillars, and you're going to hear a lot of impact statements cutting across. And I think one of them for grant making that's so obvious that has been mentioned previously is around general support. So I'll speak a little bit about that. Next slide, please. Yeah, so ITF provides general support and project grants to participatory grant making, via participatory grant making rather. Funding decisions are made by the grant making panel. So in this regard, we recognize that general support is important. In the beginning, we had project grants and started to encourage groups to apply for general support grants as well, because we realized that this is an area that needs a lot of support from groups. What we saw from this is that it's also important, not just what we fund, but how we fund. And general support grants is a very important way of doing this. And I guess we have seen that this positions organizations, especially in the fragility, agility, and the dynamic trans movements, to replenish organizing in meeting operational expenses, facilitating the actual building of movements, because the very essence of the ITF is to resource trans movements worldwide. So I think the really key factor here around grant making is how we funded and what we funded. And now I'm going to get to what we funded, which is the amount, the incredible amount that we managed to give out. So we've awarded $6.26 million to 181 grantee partners in 93 countries in 7 grant cycles. We've increased our annual grant making by 146% from the first cycle to 7th grant cycle. So we began with a bid of $500,000 and are now giving out grants of up to $1.2 plus million. I mean, that has been an incredible stride for us. And the other last thing that I'll speak about is commitment to Global South and unregistered translate organizations, simply because ITF very well acknowledges that there's a need to reach the most marginalized trans communities. And this most often is the Global South groups, translate groups in the Global South. And so we've allocated 55% to 68% of our grants each cycle to translate groups in the Global South. We've also allocated 39% to 62% of our grants each cycle to unregistered translate groups. So unregistered trans groups most often face a challenge of accessing funding, right? And so it's really important for us to find ways that that these groups rather can access funding. And so ITF is very excited to be able to do that. Next slide, please. I guess I also echo colleagues in, seeing really inspiring quotes from the community. I mean, just hearing back from our grantee partners, speaking with so much humility and so much gratitude around ITF, talking about how ITF has changed organizing and lives in different contexts has really, really been impactful as well for us, especially in terms of the qualitative aspect of this impact report, right? And I think an example of that is a group that says, thanks to the help of ITF, We have maintained and increased the work of our initiative in a critically deteriorating situation. We are under the recognition that there's a lot of crisis, and trans organizations are really, trans rights are really under attack at this time, at this point in time in the world. And so we're happy to come through and show up for trans activists. Next slide, please. So our grant-making panel, I think, is a good segue to speaking about impacts. So not just what I mentioned before, but also the actual body, that makes decisions at ITF is the grant-making panel, is a panel body that consists of 15 trans activists from different parts of the world. I mean, this is a powerful space in terms of shifting power in philanthropy, but it also sounds participatory grant making, which is what ITF is all about. And so we have seen throughout the years, grant making panel members, former and current, sharing with us feedback in this evaluation about how the ITF experience has increased, well, rather built their capacity, right? Not just learning about philanthropy, but learning about the different work from trans movements across the world, being inspired, building leadership, right? And in the survey, you can see that 80% mentioned that they increased their active engagement in philanthropy. We have seen folk also that have participated in peer review funds go off and build experience in other spaces, which is incredible. We also get report from survey GMP members that 93% increased their overall philanthropic leadership skills. 80% increased their overall understanding of philanthropy and grant making, especially in participatory grant making like ITF. And almost all of them, which is 100%, increased their ability to use these new skills and awareness to help trans-led organizations access more funding. Next slide, please. Yeah, so continuing with the grant-making panel, through this evaluation, we received feedback from them as well. So happy to share with you quotes from some of our GMP members. We see somebody's here says, the ITF has changed my life completely. That is such a strong statement. It has allowed me to get to know the trans world. This made me empower myself more and be a leader, fully committed to our causes. I think there's so much feedback that we have received from folk about how ITF has been a great influence in their activism, but also just like as an individual, being able to meet other trans activists from across the world, but also learn about what trans groups are doing in different parts of the world. Yeah. Maybe just do the next slide, please. I think that's where it is. Thank you. Maybe, so just like to underscore in a nutshell, the feeling around, we are excited that we have been able to reach a lot of unfunded organizations, unregistered groups. We are so happy to have received feedback on the simple, flexible, accessible grant making, how we fund our participatory grant making process. And we are now promising to go about next steps in terms of what's next. We launched our 8th grant cycle, so we are still accepting applications online. The deadline is January 31st, so hurry up and put those in. And we also are having new grant-making panel members who will obviously participate in the 8th grant cycle review process. That these folks will be announced in early February. And our GMP will then select the grantee partners and award at least $1.1 million in June. Again, this year we're also providing the 2nd year of funding for legal gender recognition in Latin American and Caribbean projects. 7 organizations will be receiving 3-year grants. That's $150,000 a year. We'll also be having renewal grants. or 9 organizations. They will be receiving 2-year grants. And that's, really an exciting initiative because it's is an effort around addressing the common concern around sustainable funding from our grantee partners. And then last but not least is the opportunity and crisis grants. We are looking forward to providing on a rolling basis. And yeah, so this is what we are going to, this is what we'll be looking forward to in terms of grant making. And I just spoke about what we've done. I think it's a great segue to speak also about capacity building, and I will pass the mic to my wonderful colleague Viviani to take us through that. Thank you very much.
Pasaré a hablar en español, así que si necesitan.
I'm going to speak in Spanish, so please take it in the English channel. Thank you so much for the mic, Mukasa. And yes, I will present some points about another pillar of our work, which is capacity building. Next slide, please. And so basically, along the financial resources that we provide, as Mukasa was showing us in these past years, we also have a pillar that is, and our goal that is to increase the capacity of grantees partners to secure additional funds and with other groups that provide funds and to respond to the needs of their communities. In this sense, in these past years, we have offered support and for the first place to the co-parts that have received funds in this year. Particularly this support, we offer sessions, workshops that are related to provide capacity building, strategic finances, and we have offered about 104 grantee partners, 164 trans activists from 104 grantee partners, which we think is an important number, and we hope to improve and increase that number. Also, in our when we open our funding cycles, we offer capacity building initiatives that are related with the fund writing proposals, fund proposal, and also webinars that we offer at almost 70 for at least 800 participants, and also besides the webinars that are informational about our process, we offer what we call the draft review service, where we take a look at the forms and how our documents are similar to other funders. And our intention is that the knowledge that we share and that we practice can be useful for the groups when they apply for other funding. Next slide, please. In this sense, like how Melissa presented already to us, we think that this kind of work is very important because we are empowering and supporting the strategies, the articulation that happens among our movement, and that we create these spaces to improve this work and to guide it and to provide other tools that improve every time so that the organizations can be in a better position to do the work that they want to do. This is our goal. Please, next slide. And in this sense, we have also had participation, and we have created and organized workshops to focus on capacity building. We had an event in South Africa in 2022 that we had 30 trans activists from across the African continent, including delegates from sub-regional trans networks that participated in these spaces, and we believe that these opportunities are really important. We also had gatherings in Botswana, and we had a trans pre-conference under the umbrella of the conference Changing Faces, Changing Spaces, where we had 30 trans activists, and we created a statement, a community statement. In Thailand, we had 18 trans activists participated in a workshop for capacity building that was part of the regional networking event for Asia Pacific. And though these are important connections for our work, and particularly after the COVID pandemic, that we have been investing more time in these kinds of processes. Next slide, please. And our next steps, what's next in this pillar of capacity building. We have these 3 points for this year. We will co-organize workshops with our grantees, and we will also create another webinars for draft review for the 9th grant cycle. And we will also host, between this year and next year, we will, as part of the legal recognition of gender identity in Latin America, we are going to have an in-person event with the groups that have been grantees of this project in Latin America. So this illustrates how we're supporting to capacity building and also taking from Elisa's message, we are developing our capacity more, and this is the work that we do with our communities in the trans movement. And I want to pass the microphone with the work and philanthropy.
Thank you so much, Viviane. And at this point, I also just want to recognize the time. So I'll try and be as quick as possible without negatively impacting the interpreters. So in philanthropic advocacy, really, if we could put it more simply, I think we try to influence the funding space to ensure that we are able to we strategically influence the funding space so that we're able to get more money. And we do this in 2 ways: through our own actions, so that other funders can be able to be influenced in that manner, but then also by directly speaking to other funders within the spaces that we find ourselves, so that those funders can then dedicate more of their funding to trans groups and movements. Next slide, please. So it is important that the ITF tries and and leverages more funding, because the more funding that the ITF gets, the more funding that we're able to channel to a lot of communities out there and organizations. As you know, we have had situations where a lot of funders have probably done away with LGBTI programs, or they've done away with trans-specific programs because of cutting down on staff in their foundations. So as the ITF, we've made sure that we try as much as possible to get these funds so that those funds can then be channeled to trans groups. So for example, we have managed to leverage at least $14 million since 2016. And what is also remarkable is that we have moved from the time the ITF was founded from 5 donors to about 10 donors. What is also more exciting is that over the past 1 year, we've been able to bring in 3 new private foundations. This is the Oak Foundation, Dry Linden, and Ford Foundation. And these resources are particularly important because when we secure these resources, it means that we have secured funding that can then be channeled to trans groups. We've also managed to secure funding from the US government through the Global Equality Fund. This is also particularly important because if we are going to get more money for trans groups and trans movements, the ITF should have the capacity to get funding from government institutions because that's where all the big money is sitting. So this is a huge success for us to be able to acquire money from the US government directly. Next slide, please. So like I said, we, as the ITF, find ourselves in spaces with peers, and the overall objective is that when we are in these spaces, we have the voice at the table. We do understand that a lot of trans groups and trans organizations across the globe may not have the privilege of finding themselves at the table when a lot of decisions concerning funding are made. So as the ITF, we try and make sure that we are in those spaces, we are at the table, and we push at the tables where we find ourselves that more and more funding within government funding frameworks, within private foundations, within public foundations, we try as much as possible to make sure that as they are doing their strategies, as they are reorganizing, they are also ensuring that money is available for trans groups. So we've spoken in a lot of panels, just most recently last year at the Pan-African ILGA, we had the donor pre-conference in Mauritius, the Human Rights Funders Network, global conference in Mexico. We were at ILGA World, and we are also co-chairs of the Trans and Intersex Working Group on the Global Philanthropy Project. The Global Philanthropy Project is a philanthropic affinity group of more than 50 funders, both government funders, public funders, private funders. So for us to be in that space and to co-chair a working group, it means that we are able to influence directly and indirectly this group of funders, that they may channel more resources to trans groups. Next slide, please. Okay, so what's next? I think, yeah, our role is cut out. We need to ensure that we get more money through the door. We have been invited to submit one concept note by one government funder and 2 private foundations. Like I said, government funders are the ones with the biggest money. So the more government funding we get through the door, it will also ensure that we're able to cushion trans groups from the bureaucracy that comes with government funding. So we are hoping that those will be successful. We'll continue to participate in a lot of the spaces. We have quite a number of activities listed there that are coming up. But then also we want to expand our networks, and this is particularly important. We want to apply to Prospera, the International Network of Women's Funds. We have a lot of trans exclusionary feminists. We have seen a lot of backlash against trans women, and it is important that as the ITF, we are part of these women's networks so that we are also able to advocate and influence from within and not just from the outside. At this point, I'd like to quickly pass on to my colleague, Broden, for the last part, which is the institutional strengthening of the ITF. Thank you.
Miss, this is not too long. Sometimes I say that and I go on and on a little bit, but I will not because we do want a chance for questions and a chance to engage. But just to say overall, the institutional strengthening pillar at the core of it, we really believe that a strong, healthy, and sustainable ITF is crucial, ensuring that funding moves to trans-led organizations. So we need to get our house in order. We need to strengthen our foundation in order to draw in new money and to build and expand as an organization. Next slide, please. So for this pillar, really the intention is just to build and sustain the ITF as an efficient, effective, and independent participatory grant maker. Next slide, please. So how have we done this? What are we doing for this? We look at it in a few different ways. It was mentioned in Melissa's presentation and throughout this presentation as well. Mukasa said it around trans leadership. It's very important to the ITF that we are made up of a majority of trans people and that we're looking at ways to build, support, and amplify trans leadership and decision-making in the groups we fund 100%, but also in the organization itself. So 24 trans activists have been engaged with the ITF since our beginning. We had a steering committee model first, which then transitioned into the board of directors in 2022 when we became incorporated as a Canadian nonprofit. That incorporation was one of the most exciting developments that we've seen in the last while. It was a moment for us to step out on our own. Up until that time, we had been fiscally sponsored by Estrella, which was great, and we wouldn't be where we are without that initial seed support. But in the vein of independence, in the vein of sustainability, in the vein of supporting trans leadership, we needed to set out on our own, and so we did. And we were also able to complete our first independent audit in 2022. And for those of you who are financy people, that's a big deal and marked a big moment for us standing on our 2 feet. We've also in the past few years published our first strategic plan. That will come to the end in 2025. It's also where we derive these pillars that we've been speaking to you about. So the strategic plan is super important to us in how we do our work. And I'll mention a little bit more in a future slide. But just to say, we've also the size of the ITF has grown considerably. I mentioned at the beginning, Mukasa was the first staff. I was the second. Those were 2 of us back in 2017 with some part-time support, and now we're at 7. So we've seen, really huge growth, 250% increase in staff members, which means more capacity, more ability to do the work that we need to be doing. We've also built out our infrastructure. We developed a HR handbook, chart of accounts. We've been strengthening our finance side. So the organization itself has been going through quite a few changes at a real fundamental level, but all in the spirit and in the vein of ensuring that we're able to steward more money so that we can get that out the door to trans-led organizations. And for those of you who have applied or are in the midst of applying for the 8th grant cycle, you'll know that we launched a new grants management system, which really allows us to centralize all of those applications. Before, we did so much of it manually, and so this marks a really big moment for us in being more efficient from our side, but also we think a better experience for those of you who want to apply. Next slide, please. So what's next for us in this area? The incorporation was the big step, and now we're kind of settling in or bedding down. We're going to be moving into a strategic planning process for our next strategic plan. And as part of that, we do want to have some consultations with wider trans communities. Some of you may have been part of the consultations that were done back in 2016, but we also want to look at how we can hear from the voices that we don't always hear from, who haven't received grants, who haven't been part of the ITF. We've also been in the process of implementing and formalizing a board training and induction program. This came up specifically in the impact evaluation, and so we have specifically responded to it. And as part of that as well, we're trying to think a little bit about how can we better engage our board and our grant-making panel to a certain degree in fundraising and in philanthropic advocacy that Chavuli spoke of. So for the most part now, it's really the staff who do that, but we've been trying to envision how we can better utilize the skills and experience of those amazing activists who are part of the organization. We're also going to be looking for new board members at the end of this year. So keep an eye out for that. Those are always open calls. The board will determine exactly how many members, but likely between 2 and 4. And members of the trans movements are very welcome to apply, and they're 3-year terms. And we will also be working on a new website and branding. We've had the same website for a long time, so we feel now is the moment, in the spirit of communications and transparency, to kind of bring up our game. Next and last slide, please. What we will also be doing in the spirit of expanding, as I mentioned, we are at 7. We're going to be hiring at least 2 new staff members this year. We'll be hiring a grants manager and a new program officer. So if you're interested in that, please stay tuned. We will announce those publicly, so you're more than welcome to apply if you feel like it fits. And then the last thing I just wanted to briefly mention was around the investment in staff culture. We're a small organization. Virtually all of us are trans. We come from very different locations, identities, experiences, and we've been spending a lot of time thinking about how we can improve and develop our work culture and environment. So we've had some folks come in and work with us, and this is a priority going forward. You know, how can we look critically at power dynamics at play? How can we look at how we can better support staff members, particularly staff who are working in very hostile contexts, but all of us, right? Really thinking about how we can improve interpersonal dynamics and communications and all of that. So investing in ourselves. And with that, I will wrap up and just say, I think, you know, the ITF is only as strong as the different bodies that make it. And so thank you to all of you. Many of you on this call have been involved in some way or another. And this impact evaluation is the culmination of all of that work from our end and your end, and we're very grateful for your continued engagement. And with that, I will stop. Thank you very much. And why don't we transition to the Q&A? I could see there were a few questions that came up. Luca, maybe you could read them back, and then if folks have any other questions, we'd be very happy to hear from you.
Sure, Broden, let me just scroll the chat. I think I saw some questions. And Viviane, if you could help me with questions in Spanish.
Luca, the question was not really a question. It was more of a comment about the Central America situations and difficulties for trans organizing. And I'll read also Veronica's comment in a bit.
Great. I did see there was a question about the difference between the staff, GMP, and board, and I think you addressed that, Viviane. But just to say that these 3 bodies work very closely together, particularly the staff, you know, in relation to the bridge to the board and to the grant making panel, but they are also independent. So the grant making panel's main focus is to make the decisions about grants. And that's something that's really unique about ITF, as that participatory piece. We're not the only one. There are many participatory grant makers, but we are the only participatory grant maker that focuses on trans-led groups across the globe. So the decisions that are made about every one of our general grants goes through the GMP. And then the board itself does the overview of the strategic finance piece, supporting staff, and does, of course, ratify the decisions of the GMP, but they do operate differently. And then us as staff, we're there to make sure that the strategic plan, that the goals set out, that they get done, and that we do the operational work. So hopefully that clarifies it a bit. If it doesn't, feel free to ask more. Vivi, did you want to answer the other question?
Voy a solamente comentar el comentario que
Just
Valentina
to comment what Valentina shared with us, that Latin American trans community in Latin America and the Caribbean, particularly from Feminaz Latinas Chile, are sharing admiration for our work, and that the skills of trans groups are reflected there. Thank you for sharing. Thank you, Valentina, for being with us and for sharing this comment.
Thank you,
you so
Viviane.
much.
I see a question in the Q&A box from LaShawn Samuel. Please, is there any collision ITF between the Feminist Forum? I ask because they are really homophobic here in Nigeria, that they intentionally don't want trans women on the platform, the NNF, Nigerian Feminist.
I will maybe speak more broadly. I mean, from a specific point of view, no. I mean, Chavuli mentioned this a little bit. Like, one of our upcoming focuses is really thinking about that intersection of feminism with trans rights and how we can be involved and engaged in those conversations, given the, rampant rise of trans inclusionary radical feminism, but just generally, this response to trans women and to trans movements or organizing. And we really need to be in those spaces and part of those discussions, in part because we are a feminist organization and we believe that our work is grounded in a feminist analysis and framework, and in part because we bring really important voices to those spaces. So we have been looking at different ways, not specifically in Nigeria per se, but we have been looking at different ways that we can be in feminist funder spaces and feminist civil society spaces. So it's part of an ongoing discussion. In part, up to now, it's been a little bit capacity based. We've spent a lot of our energy working more in LGBTQI funder spaces, but we are looking now at where we need to expand to be part of these discussions and be part of influencing where that funding goes to ensure that it is going to feminist organizations that are trans inclusive, or even better, trans led. So, I think it's an ongoing conversation. I don't know if Chavuli, if you wanted to add anything to that.
Not really. I think it's just what you'd say, but just to appreciate that this is something that we have been through over the years, and just to see, the rise in radical feminism, like how do we as the ITF engage in those strategic spaces, be part of some of those feminist spaces, women's spaces. I mean, we have CSW, the Commission on the Status of Women, coming up in March at the UN. How can we and some of our allies be visible in those spaces and do the advocacy that we need to do there? We recognize the tension that is there and the rising animosity, and we're trying to look at strategic ways of how to engage in those spaces. But yeah, we haven't particularly engaged in Nigeria to be specific, but we've started looking at it from a more global level. And I think from the lessons that we'll learn at that global level, we'll be able maybe to trickle down to the regional level. Thank you.
Are there any questions for Melissa or anything in relation to the impact evaluation, or just generally for the ITF? We're all here, so, well, not all of us, but I just saw this one, anonymous. Thank you for all your work and support resourcing trans movements. My question is, does ITF consider collaborations with activists who have ideas to advance a particular trans issue further to develop and actualize this? So I suppose yes and no, a little bit. And what I would say is that we are open to it. And, I think it's important to us to understand what's going on the ground and what, because global trans movements are plural, they're complex, they're, very distinct, and we're 7 people. And so I would say that we are not going to be experts on every country, every context, every dynamic. So there is a piece, obviously, where we want to engage, but I think it depends what that engagement looks like. I mean, we don't have a lot of discretionary funding for one-off ventures, for example, right? Typically, the most of our funding that goes to trans-led organizations goes through our general grant cycle, like 96% of it or whatever. So that's really where the majority of the money goes. And those are organizations that are selected by the grant making panel. And so while we can have conversations with individual activists, we don't influence that process. So that's one part of it. And while we are introducing, as Mukasa had said, a crisis and opportunity grant, those have sort of specific parameters in the sense that they're time bound, there's something that has come up. So, I mean, what I would say is, it's hard to answer that without knowing more about what that would look like. But I would say I'm very open to having that conversation. If you want to reach out, Luca, maybe you could share the general email, reach out to us and we can tell you. And if we can't support you, we can be honest and we can see if there's other folks that we can connect you with, or we'll just tell you, or maybe there are ways that we can engage, right? I think that is, our program officers do engage in various ways on the ground with grantee partners and trans movements. So we do want to know, I guess the question is, what support do you need? And that's something that we can't determine right now, but write to us and we're happy to have that conversation. I don't know if my colleagues want to add to that. So there's the main ITF email address is info@transfund.org. And you'll reach Karen, who couldn't be with us today, but she will get back to you or she'll forward it on to who needs to see it. So I would say if you have a question, just reach out to us and we'll do our best to respond. And if we can provide information or links to other resources, we will. I think we see ourselves as also a hub or a kind of connector, right? Like our program officers have a lot of experience with work on the ground, different funders that fund in regions. We've been doing this a long time. So if you're looking for funding and we can't support you, maybe we can connect you to a funder you don't know, or we can link you or provide more information. So I would say bear that in mind because we're not able to fund all the groups. I think last year we usually fund between 10 and 15% of all the applications we receive. And that's eligible applications. So that's 10 or 15% of the trans-led group. So there's a lot of really amazing groups that we do not fund, but we are looking at ways to support that work because we do know it's important, and hopefully we can get more money so we can get more money out. But in the meantime, we do look at other ways that we can provide support. So just reach out to us if you're interested.
Thank you, Broden. There was also a question about the grant making challenges we encounter. Maybe we could talk a little more about that.
I thought that was mostly for Melissa.
Yeah, I think I saw that question right before I talked about the grant making challenges section. So I think I covered that, but if there are further questions about that, I'm happy to explain. So just write a note in the chat, please.
And folks, if you want to speak, just raise your hand and we will unmute you. You can ask your questions.
Anyone? We're sharing the link to the impact evaluation. If you haven't had a chance to read it, please do. If you have questions after the fact, or things that come to mind, reach out to us. We're always happy to engage. The impact evaluation is also available in Spanish and English on our website. Well, if nobody else has any questions or comments, I think we'll wrap up. Even though we were a little late on our presentation side, we caught up time. So thank you all for being with us for almost 90 minutes. We really appreciate that. We know you're super busy, you have a lot on, but we really value this moment and a chance to share with you some things about our process, where we're going, and some highlights. As I said, please reach out to us if you have any other questions. And yeah, huge thanks. And thanks to Melissa, obviously, for doing all that stellar work, and to the ITF team for being here. Thank you, Luca, for all your work on making this happen. It ran very smoothly, so much appreciated. Technology is always tough, so thank you. And big thanks also to Chavita and Maria for interpretation. And thank you all. And please stay in touch with the ITF and please keep engaging, and we'll be in touch. Take care.